Hello and welcome to another conversation at Raisina 2021. A big and warm welcome to our virtual audience as well, as Raisina, for the first time in its history, actually goes online because of the circumstances we live in. It's interesting because I think if this was a physical session, this would be one of the sessions where people rushed into the conference hall a bit earlier, pulled up their seats in anticipation, and really tried to get a good spot. And the reason I say that is because of the crucial issues that we're touching in this conversation. Not just the impact of air pollution, but also what's happened to our urban cities and our metros in the context of COVID. I can say with confidence in the last year and a half, there hasn't been a single metro that has not been ravaged by the impact of COVID and had its own administrative machinery and really the whole infrastructure collapse at some point because things are at breaking point. Perhaps for some cities across the world, that is still the situation. Be that as it may, air pollution is not going away in a hurry. Neither is it a problem that we have developed with COVID. The repercussions of air pollution, frankly, in India have been quite scary over the last few years. We have an extremely esteemed panel to talk about that, both in terms of what a post-COVID roadmap might look like, and more importantly, whether this is now the time to really take some hard action on air pollution. So let me first introduce my panel for today to you. Priyanka Chaturvedi, Member of Parliament, India. She lives and resides in Mumbai and has a strong sense of the issues that the city has been grappling with. Welcome, Priyanka. Nicholas Stern, IG Patel Chair of Economics and Government at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Stern, a very warm welcome to you as well. And Vaishali Nigam Sinha, who's Chief Sustainability Officer at Renew Power and really brings in an important perspective in terms of what the private sector is doing and can do in the years ahead. Vaishali, welcome to you as well. Let me just quickly walk through for the benefit of our audience what the flow will be like. We have 45 minutes for this chat. I'm going to open first for opening remarks from my guests and then we'll move into interventions. So Priyanka, let me open the stage with you in terms of what the big learnings have been and really where you see things headed as you look out from 2021.
Thank you so much, Mitali, and a warm welcome to all our co-panelists as well, and hope to have an engaging conversation. And yes, I do miss the offline format where we used to rush to get our best seats. Having said that, yes, COVID has ravaged the city I come from. Mumbai, being a coastal city, has seen a higher caseload of COVID, and at the same time, it has also made us realize the importance of climate mitigation, climate justice, as well as the climate change and the impact that we are having in terms of metropolis cities which have high caseloads, as well as the kind of mobility that we see in these cities which have been impacted. It has impacted our economy, and it is something that we are grappling with, especially more so in the second wave. And as we speak, there are stronger measures that have been put in place by the government. But what we're speaking about is the air pollution and the larger picture globally. As far as India is concerned, I would say we are on the right track in terms of setting our climate change goals and reaching the development goals that we had spoken about in terms of reducing our carbon emissions, adding on to our forest cover, as well as looking at renewable energy sources, non-fossil renewable energy spaces. But having said that, there is a dichotomy that exists in India. On one hand, we see 1.7 million deaths happen attributed to air pollution. These are 2019 numbers that I'm quoting. 17 of our 20 metro cities are amongst the most polluted in the world. Our capital, where we speak from, also happens to be the most polluted capital in the world. But these are issues that we will need to understand. And it is interesting that the government understands that this is a challenge India will face and something that as state governments and central government we need to address. I'm glad that I come from a state which in its governance has kept environment at the core of its development, and when we talk about SDGs, it is something that we are talking about and ensuring that we do it, whether it is with the RA forest movement. I'm sure many people would have followed that entire controversy that had led to we changing the entire metro plan that came across, so that we do not take away the only forest cover, the only, I would say, the green lung of the city. So ensuring that we save that, as well as ensuring that the infrastructure needs are not impacted. we showed a way of how we can sustain both the environment as well as development. So those are areas that we need to work upon, and I'm hoping that the dichotomy that exists in India would be addressed. And considering India has taken a lead globally, it would be appreciated by those countries which have been guilty of higher carbon emissions in history.
Priyanka, thank you for that and for setting both the local context for Mumbai and what's happening with India as well. Professor Stern, Nick, if I may turn to you for a little more global perspective on what's happening. There's so much activity around COP26. If you could put your opening remarks in context with all that talk and what the reality is on the ground with air pollution.
Thank you very much for having me, and I wish I could be back in India with you. I've been coming to India once or twice a year since 1974. It's a big part of my life, and I've been living and working in one village in Moradabad district of UP throughout that time, looking at how that's changed and developed. And I've lived and tried to breathe in both Delhi and Bangalore. The first thing is the magnitude. The loss of life from air pollution around the world is close to 10 million a year. Now, some internal, some external, but the fraction internal is falling as cooking methods get better, and the fraction external is rising, with particularly transport and polluting transport in the cities. Worldwide, 10 million a year, as Priyanka said, well over 1 million, perhaps close to 2 million a year in India. If you think of the deaths from COVID so far in India, in the region of 150,000 or a bit more, that means that in India, the loss of life every year from air pollution is at least 5 times the total loss from COVID so far. This is immense, and the immensity of it, I think, is not really sufficiently understood. In my own country, in the UK, we kill something similar to India, roughly 1 in 1,000 people a year, something moving close to 60 million a year. 1 in 1,000, and it's like India, 1 in 1,000. It's a 1.5 million deaths. It's roughly 1 in 1,000 in India's population. From road accidents in the UK, we kill 1,700. 1,700 from road accidents compared with something like 40, 50, 60,000 from air pollution. So if the numbers come in, UK is killing 1 in 1,000 and India is killing 1 in 1,000, my guess is that it's an underestimate in India, given how difficult Indian cities are. So I think the immensity of this is simply not sufficiently well understood. The second, of course, is the association with fossil fuels. Now, we know that I've lived in Delhi. Some of you live in Delhi all the time. We know it's a combination of things. We know that in the autumn, some of it comes from the burning of the stubble from the Kharif harvest. But the bigger part of this story is really dirty transport and dirty coal for industry and for electricity. That's the big part of the story. So what you get, and Natalia, you and Priyanka, you both drew attention quite rightly to climate, the burning of fossil fuels through transport, through power particularly, is killing people on a massive scale now. And it's killing people on an even bigger scale down the track through climate change if we don't get it under control. So that's the challenge that we all face. And we have to go to net zero emissions. And this is the central headline in COP26 this year. We have to go to net zero from very simple physics. The concentrations in the atmosphere give you the global warming. If you want to stabilize temperatures, you have to stabilize the concentrations. And if you want to stabilize concentrations, you've got to go to net zero. Now, if you want to stabilize the water in a bath, the water going in and the water going out has to be exactly the same. Otherwise, the level changes. So net zero comes from the desire to stabilize temperatures. That means stabilizing concentrations. And the earlier you go to net zero, the lower the temperature at which you stabilize. So the net zero is not some kind of international conspiracy or some sort of obsession of eco warriors. It's basic physics. Because we have to go to net zero, and because there won't be many big negatives, we should make as many negatives as we can, particularly through forests, as Priyanka mentioned, and particularly through restoring of degraded land. That's very important. Prime Minister Modi has emphasized this as a big part of the story in India. But because there won't be so much negative, net zero, which is necessary to stabilize temperatures, means net zero everywhere. So the obligations then from the past history of getting rich in a dirty way, which is what the rich world has done, the obligations there, of course, mean cutting quickly to net zero in those countries. But since we have to go to net zero everywhere, it means strong assistance to those who are poorer and may have less access to technology and finance. But it's very important to recognize that we have to have net zero everywhere. And sometimes you hear the argument, well, when we've done the same amount of pollution as you did, then we'll think about it. But that's deeply, deeply misguided. And a great friend, Prime Minister of Ethiopia, just about 10 years ago, said it's not justice to foul the planet because other people have fouled it in the past. The justice comes from, and it's very important in all this, from the rich countries assisting in technology and finance the poorer countries to get there. But that the poorer countries have to get there is physics. It's not politics, it's physics. The politics is how you do it, and that's very important. So let me finish there, and I'm sure lots of things will come back. But I wanted to focus on the magnitude and the importance of net zero and the obligations of the richer countries to support. But I really worry that the magnitude of this problem is really insufficiently understood. Just the pollution is way, way bigger, orders of magnitude bigger than COVID. And COVID's big and horrible, and this is still worse. And of course, the climate change that could come is still worse than that. That would kill people on a grand scale.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think there will be many sort of points to nuance within the net zero target. But let me turn to a space where India has done salutary work. The private sector has participated. Vaishali is part of the solar energy system where India has set out some ambitious targets. Vaishali, your opening comments first before we delve deeper.
Thank you, Mitali, and thank you, Professor Stern, for those wonderful comments and the analogy between COVID and air pollution and putting that in context. It's really eye-opening. I'd like to thank ORF for inviting me to this really distinguished and knowledgeable panel. We are here discussing a very serious issue, and in recent times, it's perhaps the most serious issue, as you pointed out, Professor Stern. It's just a chronic problem. I think people we know closely have suffered from it. People are dying, children are dying, women are suffering from it. So absolutely toxic as an issue. And when the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, infamously referred to India as a country having filthy air, our feelings were hurt. The fact of the matter is, it wasn't said perhaps in the best manner possible, but that's the harsh reality. And the harsher reality is that many people are dying and suffering day on day, losing about 5+ years of their lives. It's not a joke. It's not a joke. And I think we need to come together, multiple stakeholders, the government, the private sector like us, thought leaders like ORF, and all of us have to really come together, states and the center, to find a problem I think enough has been said about it, and much more needs to be really done as far as execution. You know, as entrepreneurs, we always focus on execution and getting things done. And I think this is one area where we need to now start doing way more than what has been said. I think it's well understood. And just to add to some of the statistics which were mentioned, and perhaps based on the source or the time, they may be a little bit different, but yes, about 10 million deaths prematurely every year is lives being cut short for things we can control. And honestly, these numbers are larger than COVID, as was mentioned earlier, but way larger than traffic accidents and other, epidemics and war, etc. And yet we haven't seen, people taking action. There have been about, I think, 1.2 million deaths in India itself, premature deaths, and 50% of these are children. So we really owe it to this generation as well. 22 of the world's most polluted cities are in India. That's a known fact, and none of us feel proud of that. And we have to change that, and we have to change that fast. I just don't want to mention numbers around how many children die because of respiratory issues, but it is a grave concern. And in rural India, we have seen that it's a huge problem as far as women are concerned, because they're exposed to extreme forms of air pollution, because they use firewood, coal, dung, and so on and so forth. And all of this really impacts their health. And we're doing some work around that, but we really need to make sure that we can prevent a lot of deaths which are caused due to indoor household air pollution in the remotest parts of our country. Really grateful that our government has taken this up on priority and framed policies and programs to rein in the pollution. The budget of 21 had allocated 2,217 crores for tackling air pollution. And a lot has been done, but I think the problem is that, are we implementing this? Are we monitoring this? So just like a company, I think you really need to, if it is not monitored, it's not done. And so that is a problem, I think, around pollution, which we need to also discuss and talk. Just like the net zero commitments, it's also about the journey to getting there and how we're going to do. So the discussion has to move there, here as well. The discussion has to move to, how are we going to do this, and how are we going to do this better?
Thank you for that, Vaishali. Indeed, lots of data there. One part of it is the deaths statistics that we have. The other, Priyanka, is the fact that these are numbers of people who are still living with this situation. I mean, 3/4 of India is living in a situation where the PM 2.5 is well beyond the limits prescribed even by India. And India's own limits for starters are actually higher than what WHO puts out. I want to ask you, since you do represent the political community, whether you think enough has been done in terms of pushing this as a political agenda and talking about the real economic and physical cost of air pollution. Do you think enough is being done at this point?
To be very honest, while we have been talking about it, lots of politicians, political people have been speaking about it, but we have not looked at it as a collective agenda. We must remember India's civilizational history talks about how we need to ensure that every life is protected and how we give equal importance to environment for our own sustenance and our own livability. This is a civilizational value, and that is why it came easily for us to make these kind of climate change agreements that we did in the Paris climate discussions and the goals that we set in place. We did not shirk away from our responsibilities when you decided to pull away from that. But we continued with our commitment, and thankfully we've been doing well. However, there was something I had mentioned even in the Kigali dialogues that ORF had organized, that what Vaishali ji was saying about how we can maintain accountability. So when we have budgets in place, how do we ensure that accountability is also maintained? So my suggestion at that time was, maybe once in a week the Parliament takes this up as a discussion, all our SDGs, we take this up as a discussion, especially about air pollution and how climate change impacts not just lives in urban cities or people who are speaking in these forums, but it impacts one and all. And there's a lot of intersectionality, whether we talk about women, we talk about their empowerment, whether we talk about child mortality, whether we talk about how cities might get, especially the coastal cities might get wiped out if we do not look at this urgently. So yes, there is an important need, because just like COVID is politics agnostic, so is environment. We have to rise above our political differences, take this as a very important discussion, whether it's Uttarakhand, whether it's Maharashtra, whether it's another zone which is flooding or facing a drought. We need to rise above our political differences and make this a talking point on a daily basis, make people realize that this is a very urgent matter where everybody, it has to be a hands-on approach. So it cannot be in the months of winter when Delhi is seeing bad air pollution. It has to go beyond the winters. It has to go in the summers. We talk and prepare for the winters and how we do it. So those are things that we need to understand, and we need to create conversations around it. It all sounds very good that in silos we seem to be doing well. There is more forest cover. There is more waterfalls. There is a lot of things that the private companies are doing in terms of solar energy, renewable energy. But in terms of a collective conversation and a collective call for urgency is something that India could look at, and I think perhaps even the world can.
No, absolutely. You know the joke, Priyanka, they say in winter there's a spike both in the demand for amendments in the one act that we have for clean air and in the quality of the air itself going worse. Professor Stern, I want to turn to you about the whole zero dialogue, because there is some consternation amongst people, particularly in India, who have been studying the environment for a long time, that we perhaps will start chasing a target that is not meant for us, and neither does it have enough backstops and checks for a country like India. What I'm trying to say, more simply put, is that there's a lot of blocks that are not in place for us to get to the point that we're being asked to, and we might actually do that because of global perception or global pressure. Would you agree with that? And what kind of building blocks do you think we should be working at, particularly as we emerge from COVID or attempt to emerge from COVID?
Thank you very much, Mitali. Two crucial things here. One is the basic physics. If you're going to stabilize temperatures, you've got to go to net zero. And India is so big that if India is not at net zero, the world will not be at net zero. There's nothing controversial there. The net zero is the physics, and the size of India is the size of India. Yeah? And we all hope that the Indian economy will grow, but grow in a new way, so that living standards for everybody, living standards in the broad sense in India is. What follows from that? Because there's nothing controversial in that. It might sound controversial, but net zero physics and the size of India is the size of India. So we won't stabilize world temperatures unless India goes to net zero. The question then is when and how. Yeah? And if we want to stabilize at tolerable levels, then the whole world needs to go to net zero in the middle part of this century. So that's really the answer to the when. Again, it's the physics and what temperature we can tolerate. So that seems to me should be straightforward, because it follows so simply from the physics and the size of India. What's less straightforward is how you get there, and the role of others in collaborating with India to do that. But not whether India should get there. That seems to me should not be controversial, because it comes from the physics and the size of India. So how do we get there? And that's the second point that I hope it's all right if I say we. When we talk about India, it's a big part of my life and meant so much over the years. How do we get there? It's essentially, it's important to recognize, and Vaishali has really been making this point, that it's a very attractive journey. I mean, cities where you can move and breathe sounds like a good idea, even if you've never heard of climate change. Agriculture, which is more productive and less destructive, is a good idea, even if you've never heard about climate change. Bad agriculture turns places into dust bowls. I've lived in Delhi and I've lived in Beijing, and the dust just piles in from degraded land. So improving our land improves our productivity, improves our resilience, and it captures carbon in the soil. The forests are in many ways our lungs. the forest, we have to be thinking in terms of natural capital and natural infrastructure. The mangroves give us protection against storm surges. They help nurture the fish on which livelihoods depend. They even look after the tigers on which tourist income depends. So much of these investments, whether we talk about having transport in cities that allow us to move and breathe and be productive, whether we talk about cheaper forms of electricity, which are the renewable forms of electricity, already cheaper than coal. So much of what we have to do, mangroves, forests, restoring degraded land, public transport, cleaner and cheaper electricity, this is good development. It's good development. It's rising living standards. It's a last century perspective to say that we either have growth or we have the environment. It's a complete mistake, and it's a destructive mistake. The challenge is the how we get there, how fast we can go, what kind of investments that we can make. And when we start to look at that in detail and use the ingenuity of the world, and indeed the ingenuity of India in the digital management of systems, in the producing of solar, it's India that crashed the price of the LED light bulb by buying in bulk. A lot of this ingenuity is in India, and a lot of the new ways of doing things are coming from India. The system of root intensification of rice, a lot of that was sort of taken forward in Bihar. This is a story then of creativity, a much better form of development, but you have to invest. You have to invest to get there. So that should be what our questions are around. How do we do these investments? What sorts of investments? Not whether we should do it or not. That's a very serious mistake, both for the world, but particularly for India.
Vaishali, there's two parts to that investment decision. I mean, as Professor Stern pointed out, do we know enough about the sources? Yes, we do. Industry, transport, biomass. Do we have enough evidence in place? Again, yes, we do. But I guess the last question is, are we acting enough in terms of investment, both financially as also on a policy front? Because the one criticism that has often come up is the fact that policy is extremely fragmented. I mean, for years now, we've been talking about this airshed approach, but we do not have that in place.
Thanks, Mitali, for that question, and thank you so much for highlighting, Professor Stern, that green and growth, they go hand in hand, and I think that's critical. And as I said, Mitali, earlier, that we all get it. We all get it. The government authorities get it. The private sector gets it. The individuals get it. Children get it. Everybody gets it, and I think we really need that determination to commit and act, really. And, I think it's important that we all have to understand, that it's not an individual journey. We have to really collaborate. So the government can make policies, but we need somebody to really make sure that they are implemented, and they are implemented well, with good governance, no corruption, and we also need people. I mean, just think about it. If we have a policy and it's being implemented well by the bureaucracy, and citizens are following it, I guess a lot of our problems would be done. I mean, we will not really have the kind of industrial pollution, the vehicular pollution, and all sorts of pollution we see around us, right? So I think policies basically to clamp down old polluting plants, I think, is critical, so that we can nip the sort of bud right there. I think they should be strictly enforced. We really need more climate entrepreneurs, talking about innovation and talking about prices. I mean, in India, we saw the price of renewables drop from upper double-digit numbers in around 2011-12 when we started our business, to now where it is low single-digit paisa for generations. So huge amount of work can be done by scaling, by R&D, by partnering between industry and academia. We've seen it, that is very successful. Perhaps policies to encourage that. And as we look at, the US, when Secretary Kerry was here, we had a roundtable with him, and we talked about funds to be directed towards industry-academia partnership. that money can be put to good use here in terms of actual implementation on assets on the ground, and to see the change literally. And this is where people really need the funds, right? Because this is where most of us suffer the impact of climate. When I say this, I mean India is a large part of that cluster of countries where we're actually really getting displaced and suffering from various kind of climate change related impacts. So I think policies around that, and just most importantly collaboration. So for example, air pollution, if you look at how we are working, doesn't matter if you have something in the budget, you do need Punjab and Haryana and Delhi to work together to look at the stubble burning issues and what is it that we can do. I led a task force with one of the industry associations to do a pilot in Punjab to see that, how is it that we can actually, kind of decrease stubble burning by, using happy feeders and various other sources. It works, right? So if we can focus on implementation, if we can focus on collaboration and working together, and policies can be put to good use in partnership with the private sector, and we all come together to get this done. There's been countries around the world who've shown that, it can happen. For example, the World Economic Forum is on an afforestation drive, and we are in discussions with them to see what is it that we can do here in India. So much to be done, international collaboration, collaborating here, and just being focused on doing it. I think not saying it as much now, but just doing it.
Priyanka, I don't want to sound like the Grim Reaper, but what are the consequences of us not acting in a post-COVID world? I mean, there is already early research saying that cities that had higher pollution were perhaps more greatly affected by COVID, purely because it's a respiratory disease to start with. If we don't act now with alacrity, what do you think might be the price that we end up paying?
I wouldn't even want to venture into the kind of price we would be paying collectively as a nation or the world at large, because in case we do not take this as a serious challenge and a serious threat to existence, there's no steps we can take forward. We'll only move certain steps because we're committed to those goals. But in terms of everyday living, if we do not make those changes, it is going to be a challenging task. In terms of funding, I'm a firm believer of one thing, that the country, especially India, at the state, in the course of its developing economy, has committed to some serious targets which can hurt us at times. So it does become imperative that in terms of partnerships, in terms of funding, those countries who have disregarded the environment, disregarded the impact it has on climate change, would need to step up and fund those nations which have committed to climate goals, are committed to achieving those goals by getting into partnerships. I think US is getting into, like someone was mentioning about Mr. Kerry being here, and he's speaking about partnerships with the US. So these are the countries which need to step up, the developed economies of the world, which would need to handhold those economies which were growing and have committed to climate goals, are committed to it because the Prime Minister is leading it, and various states understand the impact it will have. So till we do not make this a conversation which is urgent, which is supreme, which is above all else, considering post-COVID dynamics, would also keep in mind the air pollution and the air we breathe, is something we all need to collectively look at as a nation. And I definitely have always believed that the burden of ensuring that we reach net zero emissions would be on those developed economies who have disregarded for years the entire impact that their development has on the environment.
Nick, Priyanka raises an important point about financial ability and capability. I mean, India as well has set out a target in terms of budget allocation, but it's modest. It's 300 crores for the National Clean Air Program. And, if you were to break that up, even for a small city like Dimapur, for example, you need 90 crores just for that one city. It's clearly not enough. What can the rest of the world do, the developed world, if you want to call it that, do to step in and help with providing the funding that is necessary in order to do this?
The finance story, particularly for infrastructure, is absolutely central. And I want to speak about that for a moment or two. But one thing that we should have emphasized a bit more in our discussion is the income distribution part of this story, because it's the poorest people, as in most things, but particularly in air pollution, it's the poorest people who are hit earliest and hardest. Just like climate change, just like COVID, but particularly in air pollution, it's the poorest people who are hit earliest and hardest because they're less capable of protecting. They can't sit inside a car. They're walking, and the exhaust from the lorries comes where they are in a very direct way, and well, you all know the reasons. But I think the income distribution part of this we should be very clearly stressing. Now the finance, and particularly the finance of infrastructure, and the urgency which Priyanka and Vaishali were drawing attention to, is absolutely fundamental. The world's infrastructure will roughly double in the next 15 or 20 years, double. The world economy will roughly double in 20 or 25 years. And of course, India's economy will double in much less than that. If you grow at 7%, you double in a decade. Yeah? So if that new economy or that new infrastructure, which in 10, 15, 20 years is coming into being alongside the one we have already, if it looks anything like the one we have, then say goodbye to 3 degrees, let alone 2 degrees. And that would be devastating, particularly devastating for India with its vulnerability to cyclones, and particularly to how much of India's water comes off the Himalayas. So that would be an absolutely devastating story. Now, we've been emphasizing here that the route to net zero is not a burden. It's actually a mistake to call it a burden. It's a much better form of development, but you have to invest to get it. And that's the challenge. Because it's a very attractive form of development, doesn't mean it's easy. It's not easy, but it is clearly attractive, and we must embark on it, not as a burden, but as something that's a much better way of doing things. But we've got to work out how to get it done, how to do it. And a big, big part of that story is the infrastructure. And India has an advantage in that sense, is that a much smaller fraction of the infrastructure it will have is already in existence than is the case in other countries. So India can build better. India can do it better. And India's ingenuity will do it better. But you've got to get the finance and the policy and the organization to get the investment done. And I think it's particularly on the finance side that the rich countries have a duty to do much better. The international financial institutions have a very big role to play. I think the World Bank can do much more in India, and to be fair, it's working out how it does more in India, but its main shareholders, the richer countries, have to enable it to do that. Part of that, of course, is the capital structures it works with, but part of that is refunding those institutions. The AIIB, the Asian Development Bank, and new very promising development bank, which we now know is coming in India, that can collaborate with those international financial institutions. And what they can do is not necessarily supply all the finance, because it's so big that the majority of it will be in India, but they can help share the risk. And if they can share the risk, particularly the early stage risk in infrastructure projects, then Indian private sector finance can come in very strongly. So I think we have to talk about the volume of finance, but we also have to talk about the nature of the finance, particularly associated with managing and sharing risk. And there I think the international financial institutions, working closely with Indian financial institutions, of course, because India leads the way on this, the others are there to help, that could be of fundamental importance. But it's got to be in this next 10, 15 years when India will be building so much of its infrastructure. So there's tremendous opportunity for collaboration and a duty for the rich countries to help with the finance. But the detail of how it works and how the risk is managed is going to be very important.
We are completely tail-ending our conversation. So Priyanka, let the final question be to you. What role do you see popular sentiment or public outcry or outreach making in this? Because it's an important mobilizing factor, but it has the danger of over onto the wrong end. And I think the feeling people come away from in cities is that all measures are piecemeal. You put up one of those pollution towers at at a busy intersection and you say that's going to work, or you do an odd even, as you said, in the month of November, and you feel that's going to work. At some point, public sentiment starts to tick towards the side where people have had enough. What can we do to really sort of mobilize this in a positive way and actually make change happen within cities and communities? Because cities are the first connect to a government.
Absolutely, and Mumbai especially, and I keep bringing it back to Mumbai because Mumbai has been leading this, whether it was the RA forest issue, whether it is about pollution, battling pollution because of the infrastructure development that's happening. We need to have a balance. There cannot be criticism of an idea where we are balancing both the environment as well as the development goals. So those are things which should become a priority, cutting across state, cutting across political parties, because like I said, this is a politically, I would say it has nothing to do with politics, it has to do about mere existence. And that is something all political parties need to create an agenda. There should be a climate agenda in every political party's manifesto when they take it to the people. That is the only way people would associate with parties being serious about their commitments. So you have, like I said, when we're working in silos, so in Goa, you have protests for Mullaim forest. Then in Uttarakhand, we saw the entire, flooding that happened. And also at the same time, how the corridors, the elephant corridors are being taken away in the garb of development. So it cannot be piecemeal. It has to be as a whole, and it should be keeping all stakeholders in mind. And also for the residents and the people who are activists, they need to, the trust deficit that you see amongst the governments, the policies, and the people is very high. They would need to support those parties, they would need to support those individuals who are making environment the crux of every discussion. So that trust deficit also needs to reduce, and all stakeholders should come on board looking at this as the most most important thing to be discussing and deliberating on and finding solutions to.
You're absolutely right. Thank you, all three of you, for such a robust conversation. I think this one sits at all intersections: public, private, political, global, local. The time to act is now, really, or if the time to act was many years back, but alacrity should be exercised now. My deepest thanks to all my guests for joining in across time zones. Thank you very much again for joining in and speaking with me. Thank you.